Hello. Today we're going to be looking at the Islamic world in the period 1200 to 1750 CE. The Islamic world is spread all across Eurasia and North Africa. This video will, for the most part, focus on Southwest Asia and North Africa. What you see on the screen right now is the Kaaba in Mecca, which is the holiest city in Islam, and this is during the annual event known as the Hajj. What you see here is the region of the world that we'll be focusing on in this video. This represents what this region looked like politically in the year 1200. It's important to note that technically the Roman Empire did not die. It converted into what we refer to as the Byzantine Empire, and it still exists here in 1200. And you can see all of the lands that are in the light pink. That is the remnants of the Byzantine Empire in the year 1200. The Turks arrived in the 11th century and destabilized this region, and along with the Crusader kingdoms that you can see are in the dark pink right there on the eastern shores of the Mediterranean, the Islamic world in this area at least was weak and divided. You have the remnants of the Abbasid Caliphate, which is based around Baghdad, but it's a very small amount of territory that was controlled by the Abbasids at that point. Now, we've already spent some time looking at the Mongols, so we know that when the Mongols arrive, they kick everybody's butt. They destroyed the Abbasid Caliphate and sacked the city of Baghdad, but they never entered Anatolia or India, and those are largely geographic reasons. Eastern Anatolia is very, very mountainous and difficult to traverse for armies that are unfamiliar with the area. And India, of course, is protected by the Himalayas to the north, and there's a very harsh desert in the western part of India that also made the territory very inhospitable for conquerors. Now, the Mongols did, of course, maintain the Silk Road so that the economy would continue to thrive. But they were eventually turned around and stopped from moving any further into Southwest Asia by a group known as the Mamluks. The Mamluks were one of the main players in Southwest Asia and North Africa during the medieval and early modern period that we're studying right now. The Mamluks were more of a cultural group than an ethnic group, although many of the Mamluks did originate from Central Asia. They were a Turkic-speaking people, but Mamluk just means slave. It means slave in the Arabic language. And for the most part, the Mamluks were military slaves. So these were people who were taken captive and trained to be soldiers, but they were not free. But eventually some of them rise up, and one group in particular rose up and conquered Egypt in 1250 CE. The Mamluks formed a sultanate, and they controlled much of the Levant and portions of North Africa until the Ottomans arrive and take over. So we're talking for the most part about Southwest Asia or the Levant and North Africa, and a region of Arabia called the Hejaz. The Hejaz is the holy region that encompasses the cities of Mecca and Medina, the holiest cities in Islam. So it was very prestigious as a Muslim political leader to have control of the Hejaz. It gave your power legitimacy within the Islamic world. The Mamluks successfully bounced most of the Crusader kingdoms out of the Levant, and as we've said, they were the first power to defeat the Mongols in open battle ever. Now we can see here that the Mamluks controlled about half of North Africa, and you can see that long strip going down there in the Arabian Peninsula on the eastern shore of the Red Sea. That is the Hijaz, and you can see there the cities of Mecca and Medina. And then we see to the north the Levant, that region that encompasses Jerusalem, Damascus, and Aleppo. That is the Levant. The modern day nations of Israel, Lebanon, and Syria, for the most part, make up the Levant. Going to move on now to the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was really a sultanate, technically, because the leader of the Ottoman Empire is a sultan. But it was one family, it was one dynasty that ruled from 1299 until 1924. Technically, the Ottoman Empire still existed 100 years ago. And they didn't just dominate Anatolia, but they eventually conquer all of the Mamluk territories and all of the Balkans, which is southeastern Europe. The Ottomans themselves do not refer to them as the Ottomans. They call themselves the Osmanli, which are the followers of Osman. And Osman himself was able to take advantage of the fact that the Byzantine Empire was very, very weak, and all of the little Turkish powers in Anatolia were very divided and competing with one another. And so that gave Osman the opportunity to start to build an empire, which he did. The Ottomans were a local power in Anatolia, though, until the Byzantine emperor invited the Ottomans into Europe. The Ottomans were a land-based power. They had no ships, they had no navy, and so they could not cross the bodies of water that separated Anatolia from Europe without the support of a seafaring power like the Byzantines. And so a very short-sighted Byzantine emperor thought it would be a great idea to invite the Ottomans into Europe to deal with one of his rivals. And so he did so, but unfortunately for him and for the Byzantines, the Ottomans never left, and they ended up conquering large chunks of the Balkans until such time as the Byzantine Empire really was only one city. By 1453, all that was left of the Byzantine Empire was the city of Constantinople. The walls of Constantinople had really never been breached. Constantinople, as you can see from the map, was a city built on a peninsula, and it had seawalls that went all the way around on the sides that faced the water, but they had these massive, massive land walls that were built that blocked the peninsula off from the west. And over 1,000 years, no invaders, no military power ever breached the land walls of Constantinople. They were 1,000 years old. They had never been breached. But gunpowder changed that. And the Turks convinced meaning they forced them to, their Hungarian subjects, people who lived in Hungary but were under control of the Ottoman Empire, they were forced to build massive, massive cannon. And they used those cannons over a 2-month siege to take this city, to take this one last remaining bit of the Byzantine Empire. Now, the Byzantines reached out to Western Europe and begged for help. They begged for help from the Holy Roman Emperor. They begged help from the King of Spain and from the King of France, and no help ever came from Europe. They got nothing. And as we know from looking at the Mongols, if an invading army rolls up outside of your city and says, open the doors and we won't kill anybody, and you decide to keep the door closed, then when they finally do get the door open, they're going to murder everybody, which basically happened. There were 3 days of pillage after the conquest of the city. Stories about the streets running red with blood, horrible, horrible stuff. During the siege, though, and leading up to the last days of the Byzantine Empire, you have an exodus of scholars, of Greek scholars, leaving Constantinople and going to Europe and finding jobs as scholars and tutors and teachers. and they bring their knowledge with them. And particularly in Italy, they really are one of the sparks of the Renaissance. That the discovery of the classics, the discovery of all of the ancient Greek and Roman texts, well, those were brought back to Italy by these Greek scholars. And so they really do help create the Renaissance, which we've looked at already. The Sultan who was in charge during the conquest of the city of Constantinople was a young man who was 21 years old when he completed that conquest, named Mehmet Fatih. Fatih just means the conqueror. I believe he was Mehmet II, but we usually just refer to him as Mehmet the Conqueror. He intended to rebuild the city. He wanted Constantinople to be his capital. And so that's part of the reason why he wanted to conquer the city. But he was a builder, Mehmet, and so he expanded the empire further into Europe, and he was a modernizer. He built a lot of public works. He really wanted to rebuild the city of Constantinople after its conquest. He was also a very tolerant guy. He was very worldly and educated. He had many, many tutors from many different places. And he was multilingual. He could speak Turkish, of course, but also Arabic and Greek and I think French. I think he might have spoken French as well. So a lot of different languages that gave him access to a wide range of knowledge. Part of the reason why he might have been tolerant, particularly of the Christians, is that it is believed that his mother, who was a slave, may have in fact been a slave from somewhere in Eastern Europe, meaning that she was Christian. One of the groups, though, that he was not tolerant of were these mystical Islamic devotees who worshipped Islam in a different way, and they were very, very popular, and Mehmet saw them as a threat to his power, and so he cracked down on them in a pretty brutal way. After Osman I and Mehmet the Conqueror, the most important Ottoman emperor, Ottoman Sultan, was Suleiman the Magnificent, Suleiman I. And he ruled for a big chunk of the 16th century and really kind of represented the highest level of the Ottoman Empire. They conquered a little bit more land later, but really we look at the reign of Suleiman as really like the pinnacle of the Ottoman Empire. And so Suleiman added lands to the empire in North Africa, Arabia, Mesopotamia, Eastern Europe, and eventually they even hit the city of Vienna, one of the largest cities in Europe, the seat of the Holy Roman Empire. And that really opened people's eyes. You know, they saw the Ottomans as a threat, but they didn't expect that the Ottomans would punch all the way into Central Europe. Now, we know from the previous lecture that Louis XIV of France was no friend at all of Austria's, really hated the Habsburgs. And so as a consequence of that, even though you have the Ottomans who are presenting this like existential threat to Europe, that didn't stop Louis from reaching out and finding a new ally in his wars against the Habsburgs. And the alliance was fairly brief, but it brought the French some benefits within the Ottoman Empire. They were given special trading privileges within the Ottoman Empire, and that ended up being very lucrative for France. Suleiman also beautified the city of Istanbul. He had an architect named Sinan who was responsible for some really amazing architecture in the city. Turning now to the role of the Sultan. The Sultan was a total ruler. He was in control of the civil government, he was in control of the military, he was in control of the religious structures within the empire. But he did have a council of advisors known as the Divan, and the Divan was led by a man known as the Grand Vizier. And the Grand Vizier was sort of like a prime minister. I mean, the Grand Vizier really was the person who ran the government on a day-to-day basis. That wasn't the role of the Sultan. And the way you become a Sultan is your father or your uncle or somebody like that is the Sultan. That person dies, and then you proceed to kill all of your male relatives so that you can then become the sultan. Because if you didn't do that, then there was always the possibility that one of your male relatives would come in and murder you. But if you've already murdered all of them, then they're not there to murder you. So it kind of worked out pretty well if you were the sultan, not so much if you were one of the sultan's brothers. But they replaced that tradition in the 17th century, and instead of murdering all of them, they just gave them life in prison. And, that kind of worked out a little bit better. One of the more brutal practices during the Ottoman Empire were known as the Devshirme. And the Devshirme was a human tax. It was a tax on Christians in the Balkans, and they literally took all of the boys periodically from various cities and regions in Eastern Europe to be converted to Islam, and then they're trained to be soldiers or bureaucrats. And it was these people, it was these young men that end up forming the backbone of the Ottoman Empire. They ran the civil service, and they were the people chosen to make up the Ottoman Sultan's personal army called the Janissaries. The Sultan relied upon the nobility in the same way that in feudal Europe, kings relied upon the nobility to provide a military force. And that meant that those Western European kings were sometimes beholden to their subjects, to the nobility. And the Sultan didn't want to have that be a problem, and so he created this crack shock troop division called the Janissaries. And the Janissaries were fanatically loyal to the Sultan himself, which meant that if the nobility ever wanted to rise up and challenge the authority of the Sultan, well, the Sultan wasn't just, he didn't depend upon them for all of his military forces. He had the Janissaries that would be there to protect him. As we said, the government was a very centralized bureaucracy, not unlike that of China. But one major difference would be that it was the young men who were collected in the Devshirme that were the ones that actually ran the government. When the Ottomans conquered lands, they allowed for some self-rule. Basically, as long as you pay your taxes and if in the Christian lands, if you participate in the Devshirme, then the Ottomans are going to leave you alone. They're going to allow you to kind of just run your community more or less the way you ran it under whatever political power used to exist. So that self-rule really did keep a lot of the Ottoman subjects pretty happy. They had these organizations, not really organizations, but self-governing communities called millets. And these operated both within the major cities like Istanbul, but also out in the countryside as well. The way that the Ottomans organized that self-rule was through religious organizations, right? So the religious leadership would be the ones that are responsible to the Sultan for the people within their religious communities. And the millets were responsible for public safety and public services within the regions in which they were in control. Within the Ottoman Empire, everyone was equal before the law in the sense that everyone was subject to divine law. Divine law we might refer to also as Quranic law or Sharia law. And Sharia is a word that frightens a lot of Americans for some reason, but it's just the structures of religious laws in the same way that, Christianity has certain laws that Christians are supposed to follow. The ultimate arbiter was referred to as the Grand Mufti. The Grand Mufti is sort of like a one-man Supreme Court, the ultimate decider about religious practice. And even the Sultan himself was bound to the decisions of the Grand Mufti in matters of religion. The Grand Mufti had a body of learned men known as the ulama. They were judges and teachers and imams who were religious leaders within Islam. But in order to be a part of the ulama, you had to be an ethnic Turk. You had to be a quote unquote true Ottoman. You couldn't be someone who came from the Christian lands, couldn't be somebody who came from North Africa, couldn't be an Arab. You had to be an ethnic Turk to be a part of the ulama. And, we see that the world is interconnected. We know this. But when we're studying the Ottoman Empire, we can't forget that Europe is there and Europe's doing Europe's thing. And in this period, Europe has their scientific revolution. And those ideas spread outside of Europe. And that creates a little bit of a situation for the Ottoman Empire because, much of the scientific revolution stands in the face of religion. And we know that that was a problem in Europe. Just ask Galileo. But what the Ottomans decide is that the use of reason to help better understand the world, that's totally cool in the sciences and in mathematics. But they prohibited the use of, not that you could really do this so well, but they prohibited the use of reason in the study of religion. Just like the Christians in Western Europe, they recognized that reason was a threat to religion, because if you go a little too far down the hole of reason in studying religion, you start to find a few flaws. And so that was the way of dealing with the ideas that were coming out of the scientific revolution, is if it's about medicine or science or mathematics, totally cool to use science, but not with religion. Ottoman society was very tolerant. It was much, much more tolerant than was Europe during this period. It was multi-ethnic, it was multiracial. There was no such thing as racism as we understand it in America today. There's no bias based upon the color of one's skin or one's native language in the Ottoman Empire. It's very refreshing as compared to looking at Europe or the Americas. The millets that we've previously described were autonomous. They were able to run their own affairs as long as they didn't do anything that contradicted the rules and regulations put forth by the Ottomans themselves. And, going along with the idea that it's multiracial and multi-ethnic, you didn't really have persecution the way that you had in Western Europe and the way that we sort of have to this day here in the United States. Minorities were able to function without any kind of really serious pushback against them. The Ottoman Empire was definitely the place you wanted to be in Europe if you were a Jew. They were not constantly blaming plagues on the Jews and suggesting that maybe Jews are drinking the blood of Christian children. None of that was happening in the Ottoman Empire. So if you were a Jew in the 17th century in Europe, you definitely wanted to live in the Ottoman Empire. From an economic perspective, the Ottoman society were really organized around guilds, and we looked a little bit at guilds when we were looking at medieval Europe, and they functioned in a very similar way. They handle any kind of trade in whatever type of guild we're talking about. And they were supposed to support their members and set price controls and things like that. Eventually, though, the merchant guilds start to operate at a disadvantage because, if you recall, the Ottoman Sultan gave special trading privileges to the French as a part of their alliance with Louis XIV. And as history rolls on, they eventually extend those special trading privileges to other European groups. And that, of course, starts to put these internal guilds at a financial disadvantage. Basically, the European merchants were at an unfair advantage relative to the Ottoman guilds. As with many Mediterranean empires throughout history, slavery did exist in the Ottoman Empire, but it was very different than the sort of slavery that was practiced in the United States. It's not chattel slavery. Chattel slavery is the enslaved person is no different than a horse. They're an object. They're not human. as with the ancient Roman Empire and some of the stuff that we saw in sub-Saharan Africa, slaves still did have basic human rights. And another way that it's different than in North America is that, for the most part, slaves were not agricultural workers. We know that the Devshirme, those people are technically slaves. The Janissaries, they are technically slaves. And so, the Sultan himself owned, technically, 25,000 people, because that's about how big the Janissary Corps and the civil service were in the Ottoman Empire. So while slavery certainly did exist, it was very different in practice, and perhaps slightly more humane than the sort of slavery that was being practiced in North America at roughly the same period in history. The Ottoman Empire was a fairly urban empire. There were a number of major cities that were under control of the Ottomans for significant periods of time. Now, in all of those cities that were controlled by the Ottomans, you have the various quarters of the city that were being run by the millets. So if we look at Istanbul, there is an Armenian quarter. And then the Armenian Christian Church is in charge of that millet. And so you can do that with a lot of different groups of people, all of whom are represented in Istanbul, many of whom were represented in the other major cities in Europe. After the fall of Constantinople, you see Mehmet the Conqueror forcibly repopulate the city. So he went out into the countryside and just essentially kidnapped people and brought them back to Istanbul and said, "Guess what? Now you live here." But that was part of his efforts to make Istanbul a major city, a modern city for that period. In about 1600, 40% of the population of the city of Istanbul were non-Muslims, right? So you can see that this is it's a multicultural, multi-ethnic city, and still to a certain degree is to this day. One of the greatest pieces of architecture on earth is the mosque that you see on this slide, and it was built by Suleiman, and therefore it was named after him. It's referred to the Suleymaniye. And on a personal note, I would say that it's one of the most awe-inspiring buildings that I have ever been in my entire life. The level of detail is just absolutely breathtaking, and that was the effort of Suleiman's principal architect, known as Sinan. But of course, it was not just Istanbul that was improved and beautified. All of the really big cities in the Ottoman Empire, so Eastern Europe, the Levant, North Africa, they were all improved and beautified during the early part of the Ottoman period. Every empire has a rise, and every empire has a decline and a fall. And we see here the beginning of the decline of the Ottomans. They are defeated for the first time by Europeans in 1571. And by the mid-1600s, you really do start to see this decline. The Janissaries are allowed to marry, and as a result of that, they have other things in their life that they care about besides the Sultan, and that makes their loyalty a little bit more complicated. The Ottomans in general become less interested in conquest. The empire basically got as big as it was going to get, and you start to see military discipline eroding. The military is not as tight and well functioning as it had been before. In 1683, they take one last shot at Vienna. It was sort of half-hearted and didn't last for very long. And by 1699, we see the Ottomans surrendering land for the first time. So they peaked in the late 1500s, and by 1699, about a century later, they're beginning to give up land. And by the early 1700s, they recognized that their military forces really weren't at a point where they could compete as effectively with the Europeans. And so then they begin to organize their army on more of a European model to attempt to continue to stay competitive in the Mediterranean area. We're going to turn now to Persia. Persia is modern day Iran, and Persia was an ancient empire going all the way back to, centuries before the birth of Christ. They fought the ancient Greeks and they fought the ancient Romans. They were one of the most important rivals of the Roman Empire. Now, the Persians were one of the dominant powers in Southwest Asia for millennia. And prior to the arrival of Islam in the 7th century, the religion of Persia was called Zoroastrianism. It was kind of like fire worship. But when the Muslims come in, they take over. It's actually Shia Islam, not Sunni Islam, that becomes dominant in Persia. And to this day, Iran is the most significant Shia Islamic country on earth. Persia, partly from a religious perspective and partly from a military perspective, Persia was always the biggest opponent of whatever Sunni empire or caliphate was in charge in the Mediterranean region. So even though everyone has now converted to Islam, that tension, that conflict between the Mediterranean Empire and the Persian Empire never went away. They were conquered in the 11th century by the Turks. So the Persian people were still there, but they had Turkic rulers starting in the 11th century. But the Mongols arrive in the 13th century and they destroy everything and take over Persia completely. And then 100 years later, a Central Asian warlord named Timur, or Tamerlane, as the Europeans refer to him, did the same thing again. So Persia went through a period where it was really devastated by a few different conquerors. Eventually, Persia is conquered by a group of Central Asians known as the Safavids. And the Safavids adopt Shia Islam and end up taking over Persia. So you have Turks ruling over the Persians, but now they're a dominant power again. They've come through that period where they've been conquered repeatedly and they've gained their strength again, and they become the primary rival of the Ottoman Empire, at least in Asia, not in Europe, of course. Persia was very important from a cultural perspective. Everybody loved Persian culture, and so that actually gave them some economic opportunities also. And in the late 16th century, we have a leader known as Shah Abbas. Shah means king, Abbas, and he helped to restore the glory of the Persian Empire, similar to what we see with some of the Ottoman sultans. He rebuilds infrastructure. He builds a new capital known as Isfahan. He establishes trade with the Europeans in order to be able to boost the economy of Safavid Persia. An important political figure in Persia during this period is a man named Nader Kuli, and he actually bounced the last Safavid Shah and he crowned himself king. But he was a military adventurer. He was very interested in conquest, but he also liked to play different other, countries off of one another to gain advantage for himself and for Persia. He did conquer northern India, the Mughal Empire, which we'll get to in a subsequent lecture. He sacked the capital of the Mughal Empire in India, Delhi, took some of their most important relics with him back to Persia. Now we also see that Nader Kuli is religiously tolerant. He was interested in finding common truths across all religions, and he also actually stopped the regular persecution of Sunni Muslims that existed within the Persian Empire. He also demanded access for Shia Muslims to Mecca. Mecca is in the Hijaz. It's controlled by Sunni Muslims, and they did not allow Shia Muslims to go on the Hajj, even though that's like one of the 5 pillars of Islam. They didn't let Shia come to Mecca, and so Nader Kuli worked to try to change that. Religious leaders were jealous of his power because it was quite absolute. And as he got older, he got more vicious and erratic and just sort of randomly execute people. And as a consequence of that, he gets assassinated in 1747, which really destabilizes the Persian lands. After about a decade of chaos in Persia, Karim Khan comes in and restores order. Now, even though he's the political leader, he refuses the title of Shah. He refuses to be called king. He's a reformer. He's interested in social justice. He wants to help the poor. Like his predecessor, he is also religiously tolerant. He made some economic improvements, primarily around trade. And we see that Persia has kind of this love-hate relationship with Europe. On the one hand, they see them as potentially a political threat, primarily at this point coming from the British in India, but they also make a tremendous amount of money off of trade because, like art objects from China, which we know that the Europeans have been really into for a long time, they also are very interested in art objects and carpets and things like that that are coming from Persia. So Persia made a ton of money off of trade with the Europeans, even though they didn't really like the Europeans so much. We see Karim Khan also built himself a new capital known as Shiraz. So this map here just shows the modern national boundaries of the lands that had been a part of the Persian Empire at various points. So, for much of Persia's existence, about half of Iraq was a part of Persia, which is part of the reason why half of Iraq is Shia, which contributes to a lot of the conflicts that the United States has been involved with in Iraq, is this religious tension, this religious division. The Persians also used to control a big chunk of Afghanistan, and so these are countries that you see there's some religious and political rivalries with right now in the modern era, and a lot of that has to do with this tension that existed around the Persian Empire for millennia. I want to thank you for staying all the way to the end of the video. Feel free to check out one of the other videos that I have on my channel.